Welcome to Not Suitable for Democracy, the independent news show about the good, the bad, and the corruption in American politics. I'm your host, Nick. I'm a progressive organizer with over 10 years of experience sharing my perspective from the left. On today's episode, we're talking about Super PACs. Not because I love them, but because there is a court case happening on July 29th that could change the future of what that means for money and politics. Now, this is a fascinating case, so you're going to want to make sure to subscribe to Not Suitable for Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, and we'll keep you updated on this case. So on July 29th, in the Appellate Court of the 1st District, we heard the oral arguments of the court case titled Dinner Table Action versus Schneider. Now, this court case actually stems from a ballot initiative from the state of Maine. Now, back in the 2024 general election, the ballot initiative called Limit Contributions to Super PACs Initiative, very straightforward, was on the ballot, the same ticket as the presidential election. Now, get this. This ballot initiative, the whole premise was to cap the amount that could be donated to a Super PAC, where that Super PAC is supporting a candidate running for federal office. So hypothetically speaking, if Susan Collins had a Super PAC and someone wanted to donate to that Super PAC, this ballot initiative would cap the amount of money going toward that Super PAC because Susan Collins is running for federal office, which would be roles like Congress, House of Representatives, Senator, or President. So, with that in mind, this would cap the amount at $5,000. And the current FEC cap for individual contributions, $3,500. So about a $1,500 difference. But now the interesting part is that during the 2024 general election, this ballot initiative not only won overwhelming support, but it won out hugely by 74.9% of the vote. And that translated to 600,191 votes. Now, by comparison, Democratic candidate, former Vice President Kamala Harris, she had earned 54% of the vote, which translated to 435,652 votes. 600,000 votes for this ballot initiative and 435,000 for the Democratic candidate running for President of the United States. That's how popular this bill was, and still is. So, lo and behold, shortly after the election saw an overwhelming support for this ballot initiative to cap the amount of money for contributions to Super PACs, surprise, 2 Super PACs sued to fight this. Now, ironically, the two Super PACs that sued are actually owned by the same guy. And that guy is Alex Titcomb. Now, I don't know this guy, but all I know is that none of my friends are trying to fight to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars of money going towards Super PACs, which is enabling the corruption in our democracy. None of my friends want to buy elections. I don't think anyone in their right mind who cares about transparency and corruption does either. But apparently, Alex feels differently. So he took it upon himself to challenge this ballot initiative. And unfortunately, in July of 2025, a lower court judge had ruled in favor of the Super PACs, basically saying, oh, well, based on Citizens United, money equals speech, you can't infringe on these groups that are acting like independent expenditures, meaning, okay, so this ballot initiative is trying to cap the limit of money equals speech, you can't cap the money because that infringes on free speech. All right, we get it. We've heard this premise time and time again. But what's happening now? So our very first episode of Not Suitable for Democracy was all about taking money out of politics. And that Pandora's box was the Supreme Court ruling for Citizens United. Now, that court ruling was in 2010, which essentially equated the idea of money equals speech. Now, how do we get to that point? Let's take it a step back, actually 2 years to 2008. Now, in 2008, we had the presidential election where in the Democratic primary, we had New York Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton running against Illinois Senator Barack Obama. Now, the Democratic primaries were going to start in January of 2008. And around that time, there was a group called Citizens United. And this group included Republicans who were very excited to release a movie or documentary about Hillary Clinton. Now, why would a group of Republicans want to release a movie about Hillary Clinton? They're not exactly her biggest fans, but it was because this documentary was going to be hypercritical of her history, and they were going to release it right before the Democratic primaries. Now, fortunately, there was a law on the books, the 2002 Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, and that bill was actually crafted by two Republicans, one being Senator John McCain. And in that bill, it basically said that corporations and labor unions were banned from using their general treasury, basic fundraising, to be put toward any electioneering communications. Fancy way of just saying political ads. Whether those ads were on TV or the radio, couldn't put money toward them. Specifically, and this is where this comes into play, those ads couldn't be created or aired within 2 months of a general election or within 1 month of a primary. So they were going to air this within the 30 days of the Democratic primary. So of course, ban, boom, you can't be airing this video that would be critical of a candidate right before the primary. However, Citizens United sued the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission. The FEC is the entity, they make the rules. So Citizens United were saying these rules are unfair. Number one, because they should be able to air it anyway. But then two, they were also making the case that because this group raised their own personal money to create this film and air it, money is the same as free speech. If they're not going to contribute to a candidate per se, then they should contribute to a group that's promoting or advocating for a specific candidate. And this group, Citizens United, was advocating against Hillary Clinton. But by the transit of property, if this money can, instead of going toward a candidate, it's going to go toward an entity or a PAC that's going to essentially allow for the airing of this electioneering communication. So eventually, 2 years later, it finally gets to the Supreme Court. Now that's where Citizens United had to go through this ruling of how we equate money equals speech. And of course, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the government cannot limit independent political spending by a corporation or a union in favor or against a specific candidate of their choice because that money was equated to free speech. And that free speech is protected under our First Amendment rights. Now, it's a really weird twist, but the idea that money equals speech, that has been the core focus of the Citizens United Supreme Court ruling. However, there is another element of the ruling that takes us to this court case today. And that element was that while now corporations and labor unions can spend unlimited amounts of money because it's protected as free speech, they can do so if and only if, or under the presumption, that they are not directly coordinating with a candidate or campaign. So it's this idea that if they were to directly give that money to the campaign or the candidate, then that would be seen as corruption. I will give you this much money, and in return, you need to do something for me. Transactional politics. So now, here's where it gets interesting. So after the Supreme Court ruled in Citizens United, this was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of having money flood our elections. Only a few months later, there was another court case, this time in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals in 2010. And that court case was titled SpeechNow.org versus the FEC, Federal Elections Commission. Now, this court case would use the precedent from Citizens United, where money was equated as protected speech. And because of that, this would then allow for super PACs. This would then create groups that were independent expenditure only, meaning that an independent expenditure is basically an entity or a group that can raise money solely with the intention of supporting a candidate or going against a candidate. So if you recall, in the New York City mayoral primary, there were super PACs that were going against Zohran Mamdani. Now, those super PACs were going against Mamdani, meaning they were like spending money on political ads, attacking him, criticizing his record, right? But that was created all based on this ruling of speechnow.org versus FEC. So now we have Citizens United, we have speechnow.org versus FEC, and now here we are with dinner table action versus Schneider. Okay, so who is Schneider in all of this? William J. Schneider is a Republican who is actually the head of the Maine Ethics Commission. And the Maine Ethics Commission in the state of Maine is the body responsible for regulating campaign laws, executing them, and the regulatory body that essentially is responsible for this ballot initiative making it its way to the voters. Now, that whole process was done correctly and legally permissible, so it's not necessarily about the process. It's just that William J. Schneider is the head of this commission, so that's why the court case uses his name. So how does Citizens United and SpeechNow.org court cases play into dinner table action versus Schneider? Okay, so 2 parts here. Now, the plaintiff is suing because they believe that the amount of money on contributions to super PACs cannot be restricted because that is coming from Citizens United that said money equals speech. That speech is protected under our First Amendment rights. So limiting super PAC contributions is going against the First Amendment. However, the second part of this is actually in favor of the defendants, those of us who don't want to see money in politics. And that is essentially saying that the speechnow.org ruling was not ruled by the Supreme Court. If we recall, it was actually a ruling by the Court of Appeals in the D.C. Circuit. And because the Supreme Court has not ruled on it, this will give the state of Maine, or the Maine Ethics Commission, a chance to then challenge that law at the Supreme Court. So, if all goes well, and the Court of Appeals in the First District rules in favor of Maine, then this ballot initiative will have to be ruled on by the Supreme Court, going up the ladder. Lower court appealed, went to the Court of Appeals in the First District, and then after that, goes to the top. This is our chance. And plus, if you think about it, this is a battle between the federal government and states' rights. You hear Republicans talk about states' rights all the time when it favors their agenda. Well, the idea of this ballot initiative, remember, is for candidates running at the federal level in the state of Maine. That would be congressional reps, senators, and the president. So imagine what a wrench this would throw in the political donation system of American politics, especially in 2028. So, how will the Supreme Court rule? Let's say if all goes well and it makes it to the Supreme Court. I highly doubt the Supreme Court will rule in favor of this during an election year as critical as 2028, especially when the RNC has already raised over $100 million in favor of Trump and the Republicans. That is a lot of spending. So, because of that money already in their bank account, I highly doubt the Supreme Court is going to say that that must be relinquished or that there's fines to pay. However, what we could also see is that they could say, great, we support this, we need to align our political donation system, and the idea that this does kind of allude to corruption, if to order to maintain integrity in our system, let alone the Supreme Court, we will rule in favor of this, but this will not go into effect until, let's say, the 2030 elections or 2032 elections. There's time. So I'm not a legal scholar, but I do believe the Supreme Court will end up going in one of those 2 directions. I do hope that they eventually keep the integrity of the institution and the integrity of taking money out of politics, because the other part of the whole of this, there are so many examples where these super PACs have shown that there is a type of coordination of corruption. Even in the mayoral primary with Zohran Mamdani, it was former Governor Cuomo's campaign who was violating campaign finance laws by coordinating with a super PAC. Yes, it is true that on Cuomo's campaign website, he was using language, right, that he wanted to share about his campaign. And it was no coincidence that a super PAC in his favor was using that language from his website to cut ads using that same verbiage and phrasing. So while he didn't exactly talk to these one-on-one, that kind of implicit coordination of, I'm just going to leave this here on my website so you can check out what I really want to talk about in my campaign. Oh, these are some good talking points that we might accidentally look at to then include in our own campaign messaging. While it wasn't as obviously direct, the implicit nature of it was basically a workaround for him being able to coordinate with a super PAC illegally while also raising tons and tons of money. This is exactly why we can't have folks like former Governor Cuomo or President Trump or all these corrupt figures in our politics. So at the end of the day, we need to push back on those who are supporting the whole financial structure of political contributions. Pay to play, the whole transactional element is gross, and we can't have our political leaders beholden to corporate PACs, super PACs, and all these big entities that are raising tons of money to pay for their preferred candidates. They do not want to see money out of politics, whereas the rest of us, we do. Because money out of politics will remove that layer of corruption. It will promote a more organic, natural sense of how we choose our elected leaders, but also strengthen our democracy. If we want more people to come out and vote, we have to remove the element of corruption because that is how we know we can truly trust the results. At the end of the day, do we really want millionaires and billionaires buying the elections for their preferred candidates, or do we want us, the people, to decide our destiny of our democracy? I know what my choice is, and I hope you will join me in getting money out of politics because that is the surefire way that we can build a stronger democracy together. And that's our show. Thank you so much for tuning in to Not Suitable for Democracy. If you like what you heard and want to learn more, then make sure to subscribe to Not Suitable for Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Or you can follow along on Instagram and TikTok. I use the same handle for both channels, so follow along at NSFD_pod. Thanks again so much for tuning in. I truly appreciate the support. Together, when we have these conversations and really listen, this is how we can stay informed, build community, and strengthen our democracy. And getting money out of politics and getting you involved is what this show is all about. And remember, democracy is not suitable without you.